I'm never giving you my Bitcoin. If you don't know where the yield comes from, you are the yield. If we continue to see this productivity boom that we're seeing primarily driven by AI right now, I think money will change significantly, because I think we can get to a spot not far from now where agents and otherwise are actually going out there and working on our behalf. And a lot of these microtransactions that we are never really kind of privy to, right? It's kind of going on in this, asynchronous world. And I think that's just a totally new concept that we're not ready for.
Plus what Brian Johnson said, don't die. Now we have so much time. What is that generation?
I think it will. Private Bitcoin transactions are kind of the holy grail.
Let's say I'm making transactions and I don't want my wife to know.
Hi. Good to see you. Good to meet you again. I'm good.
Bitcoin yield is an often overlooked, underdeveloped area in the crypto space. A very important hot topic here at the Las Vegas Bitcoin Conference, the biggest Bitcoin conference in the world. Rich Rines joins us today. He is the initial contributor to CoreDAO. We'll be talking about his project and his vision for Bitcoin yield. Welcome to the show, Rich. I am joined by
Bonnie Chang.
You mentioned in one of your speeches that the genesis of CoreDAO came from when you were back working. I'll let you explain your backstory, but you had looked at the industry and you realized that nobody was scaling Bitcoin to the same extent that you're doing now, per your words. Explain what you mean by not scaling Bitcoin.
So I think it's helpful to go back to, one, great to chat with you both, but also to go back to kind of how I got exposed to Bitcoin. So I first heard about Bitcoin back in 2011, didn't really get it. By 2013, I reread the white paper and then it all clicked. It was an alternative traditional financial system, a non-sovereign store of value, and I got really excited about that concept. And by the 2017 cycle, I was all in. Like, this is what I want to do the rest of my career. Got super, super excited about it, and I actually found my way to Coinbase, where I led Money Movements Engineering for 4 years. But during that transition, I think we lost a lot of what made crypto. And what I mean by that is we started to trade off decentralization for performance everywhere. And we saw this really peak probably in the 2020, 2021 cycle, where you saw these tokens that were 70% insiders, right? They weren't decentralized at all. And we had really started to bring more and more of just like high throughput computing on chain. But what got me excited was all these decentralized concepts, right? No one can control Bitcoin. It's non-sovereign. And we said, okay, how do we go like kind of bring crypto back to its roots? And we kind of went from first principles and we said, okay, we need to go scale Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a multi-trillion-dollar asset, but it has very little utility today besides just being a store of value. Store of value is amazing, and as I refer to it, a really sick gold. And we have done a great job of building this collateral, but what we needed was native yield. We needed the ability to go put your Bitcoin to work in a high-throughput environment like Core, and that's what we set out, and we actually launched in early 2023 before Bitcoin got cool again, right? Bitcoin got cool with ordinals and then BRC20s and all that sort of stuff, and probably peaked in terms of interest from like a retail side in 2024. But now you're seeing this 2025 cohort really that's come out of the ETFs, where it's now a financial asset, it's an institutional asset, and there's just so much work that can be done. And we've probably penetrated 1% of Bitcoin's potential.
Why, let's just philosophically speaking, why would you even need yield on Bitcoin? A purist would say, just look at proof of stake systems instead if you want yield. That already exists. Why are you trying to fit a cube into a round hole?
So I don't think it's a square peg in a round hole, if you will. It's being a store of value is amazing, and that's very useful. But if you can have yield, you unlock a new wave of products. So a good example from like a crypto native lens is Ethereum. So Ethereum post-merge, when you got yield, really DeFi explosion really kicked off again, because now you could have more protocols that are kind of similar to financial primitives. Good example of that would be like Pendle, right? Where you have the ability to split your principal token, your yield token, which is kind of similar to like coupon stripping and things like that you would have in a traditional financial system. And this is what Bitcoin's been missing, because it's historically been negative carry. So there's always been a cost to just holding Bitcoin rather than putting your cash in like money market funds, et cetera. So now you can have Bitcoin in your own self-custody, stake it with Core, earn passive yield on your Bitcoin. And if you want to go wrap that or bridge it or have an LST where you go bring it into a money market fund, or you want to trade perps again, you can do all that. But the idea is you have this large capital base that's being used very inefficiently today. Why would you not want to go create more use cases for that Bitcoin?
So just for my audience who may not be familiar with you, what is CoreDAO? How does it work? Just dovetailing off of what you just said.
So Core is a Bitcoin-powered blockchain. So on one side, we've got the largest Bitcoin DeFi ecosystem. It's about $500 million in TVL, 150 projects that are live, and about 1 million weekly active users. So it's a pretty healthy and developing ecosystem. And the other side is the highest yielding Bitcoin staking protocol. And the idea is instead of just having the normal L1 utility of being a gas token staking governance, you now have a fourth utility, which is to go earn passive yield on your Bitcoin. And both sides feed the other, right? As you get more and more activity on the L1, you get higher yields. As you get more demand for the staking yield, you see more and more activity in the ecosystem. And they work in this reflexive loop because they're all centered around the core token and that ecosystem. Core has a very special relationship with Bitcoin, where our consensus mechanism rewards 75% of the Bitcoin hash that's currently securing the core chain, as well as about 7,500 Bitcoin that's helping to secure the ecosystem. So what we want to do is build a Bitcoin aligned chain, because ultimately we want to be the second asset that Bitcoiners care about, because they can go take their Bitcoin and leave it on L1 if they want to just have it in cold storage. But if they want to go earn passive yield, they want to go put it to work, then they can bring it over to Core to go do so.
I think the most important question people will ask is, what is my risk?
So the how I always like to kind of reframe that one as well is, if you don't know where the yield comes from, you are the yield, right? And we know BlockFi, Genesis, Celsius, and probably several other people that are at this conference today that we haven't named yet. When you see centralized lending and that sort of stuff come back, it's usually like a toppy signal. And it's like, you have to be really careful and really judicious. And Bitcoin is the most precious asset in the world. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. It's the only asset that people can never have enough of. So if you're going to put your Bitcoin to work in some system, you have to understand the underlying mechanism with how that yield is generated, how it's sustainable, et cetera. So in Core system, you time lock that Bitcoin on the Bitcoin L1. So what that means is you use a Bitcoin native opcode. You only have to trust Bitcoin, but you're encumbering those funds for a period of at least 1 day. So when you're doing that, you cannot sell that Bitcoin for up to a minimum of 1 day. So you have liquidity risk. That's the only thing. If you were going to go take that Bitcoin and sell it, you cannot do that until that time lock expires. But when it comes to trade-offs, that's the most minimal trade-off that you can make, because you can do this while retaining full self-custody. You have no counterparty risk, and most people don't want to sell their Bitcoin anyways. So are you even really making a trade-off is a great question. But by doing that time lock, you're helping to secure Core's chain, and you receive block rewards and transaction fees for doing so. And if you just stake your Bitcoin, you earn one rate. But if you stake both Bitcoin and Core, you earn much higher rates. And that's how we blend these two communities over time. Because I think there's a little bit of a assumption that's incorrect, where people think Bitcoiners will accept any rate. But that's not true. What Bitcoiners want to do is they have to have some amount of inertia that gets them to go get involved in these systems. And then it's very patient capital. But you have to have attractive rates, and you have to have a system that Bitcoiners ultimately are comfortable with. And this is the first thing that I've been comfortable putting my Bitcoin in. And we designed it for Bitcoiners by Bitcoiners.
A lot of Bitcoin treasury companies talk about Bitcoin yield as well, but those terms are, I think, very different from your Bitcoin yield. When they say Bitcoin yield, it means Bitcoin per share, sort of say. Can you explain to the viewers, what is your Bitcoin yield? It would be in other tokens.
So fundamentally, what Bitcoiners are doing, whether it's in a treasury company or individually, they're usually trying to acquire more Bitcoin, right? Like that's the name of the game. So how these treasury companies mostly work is through financial engineering, right? And that's been very accretive for these people to essentially use this NAV premium to go get more Bitcoin to the treasury companies. That NAV premium, as we're seeing, is now compressing, right? And as this trade becomes more and more crowded, and there's now several of these launching every day, they're going to need other sources of yield that are not just financial engineering. So we actually work symbiotically with these other treasury companies. We have a number of discussions ongoing where they can use that Bitcoin that they have today that's in their custody to go earn passive yield, which increases their Bitcoin per share if they're just trying to go acquire more Bitcoin. Or what they can do is hold that in Core and then go stake more Bitcoin. And that's also what we're seeing as a pattern of people who have been staking in the Core ecosystem for some period of time. But ultimately, you can think about Core's infrastructure is really like the back-end yield infrastructure for Bitcoin. And that's how we want to power not just like new financial products on Wall Street, but also folks that are going to acquire large amounts of Bitcoin, like these treasury companies.
What I like about your work isn't just about Core, but you also kind of are a visionary in a way about how Bitcoin should be used. And going back to what you said earlier about Bitcoin's utility being more than just a store of value. One of the things you've said, which I like, is how Bitcoin could be used in the new financial system. For example, borrowing against your Bitcoin without the use of financial intermediaries, which is a new concept for a lot of people. How would life look like in that system?
So I think we've really just scratched the surface of Bitcoin being used. And historically, we've seen Bitcoiners just being held by like large individuals, maybe family offices. Then with the ETFs, we saw more broad-based retail adoption for the first time.
Buying pizza, don't forget.
Yeah, buying pizza. Although he still has a ton of Bitcoin. That's one of my favorite stories. It's always like, people always laugh at Laszlo, but he's got a ton of Bitcoin. I think he's doing just fine. But now what we're seeing is like these more kind of traditional wrappers that are opening up more and more groups to Bitcoin holding that couldn't self-custody or refuse to self-custody for a long time. If you can do that, you still should, but the vast majority of people will probably never do that. And they'll use one of these wrappers, but these wrappers allow you to express different views on Bitcoin. And I think that's what's really critical. So if we think about the ETFs, right? The view was, I want Bitcoin upside exposure, but I want to deal with none of the risks of like holding my own Bitcoin. So that's one view that people had. That is now going to naturally go into like what we already have, which is Core's, staking ETPs that we have live in Europe. We're going to have staking ETFs not far from now. So it's going to be people who want Bitcoin. They want passive yield in their Bitcoin in a wrapper. So you're increasing your Bitcoin per share, if you will, by having that. And then you're also going to have other sorts of like structured products and derivatives that I think will take quite a bit of mind share and flows over the next coming years. So one that I've been chatting with a number of issuers about that I think we'll see within the next, let's call it 6 to 12 months, will be these like structured products that essentially have the tails clipped. And what you'll have is like maybe 20% max drawdown on your Bitcoin, and you'll have like probably 60% max upside. And for a lot of people, having a vol dampened Bitcoin is actually a lot more appealing because they don't want to be around for the full Bitcoin roller coaster. And we'll continue to see more and more of these wrappers in these traditional lenses. And I think the flows will continue to grow. And those additional sources of vol will also open up a larger Bitcoin derivatives market. And the Bitcoin derivatives market at scale should roughly be 5 to 10 times the Bitcoin spot market. So we haven't even scratched the surface of what this is going to look like from kind of a traditional wrapper perspective.
Let's give a practical example to the layman watching this right now. Suppose I have a bunch of Bitcoin in my wallet. I don't know what to do with it. I like to buy a house. I don't want to spend my Bitcoin. I like to use it as collateral to get a mortgage. Can I do that? How?
Totally. So if you have Bitcoin and you're doing it, like let's say on Bitcoin main chain,
sure,
right? What you can do is you can find a lender that's willing to borrow against that Bitcoin. And there's a number of products and services been around for a long time.
Yeah.
But there's always been a trade-off there, which has been, okay, if I want to go do that, how do I go give you my Bitcoin or take it out of my self-custody? That's always been a challenge. So what we're seeing some people do is they're actually starting to lend against staked Bitcoin. This is something that Maple Finance will do, and they have a great partnership with Core, where they'll actually lend against staked Bitcoin, and now you can go get some of that leverage that you might want to go buy a house. But I think what we're also seeing is people that are taking their Bitcoin, they're going to wrap it and bring it onto a protocol like Colend, which is the borrow lend of the Core ecosystem, and they'll borrow USDT, USDC, et cetera, that they can then go and bring that to whatever their broker is to go buy a house. But we're still in the early phases of this. And I think we'll continue to see this pattern grow very quickly because essentially what we've created is a way to have self-repaying Bitcoin loans. And I think this is going to be a buy now, pay never type moniker that we'll see over the next few years really start to grow because you're not going to want to take counterparty risk. You're going to want to go get leverage and you're going to want to go continue to grow your Bitcoin portfolio or your traditional asset space.
Why do you say sell never? What does that mean?
Great question. So when I say buy now, sell never, the idea is that the Bitcoin itself is growing. So the LTV of that loan with staking rate plus just the dollar value of that going up is decreasing every day. And if you think about it, it's like imagine you took out a loan, when Bitcoin was 10 grand, now it's 100. You went from maybe 10% LTV to 1% LTV, right? And you'll see more and more of that, I think, become commonplace because we're going to get to a world where Bitcoin is the most precious asset, I think, for everyone in the world. And it's going to essentially act as a savings account, right? So what you're going to do with fiat debasement, all these other kind of macro shifts that, we all know and love because it's good for our bags, but bad for other things, right? You're going to just see people stockpile more and more Bitcoin, but you still have day-to-day expenses that are in forms of dollars, right? So you're going to stockpile Bitcoin, borrow against it, pay off. You'll get your earnings from your normal job, whatever, pay off that. But it's going to be kind of that alternative traditional financial system that we always wanted, right? Like if you can have Bitcoin being your savings account, your need for banks is that much less. And if you can have the ability to collateralize that in a self-custodial way, you get to really powerful places where you get rid of these intermediaries that we've been trying to do for so long.
If a bank comes in and say, I like what Core is doing, I'm going to start my own blockchain doing exactly what you do. Is that a crazy strong competitor?
I don't think they'd copy us and be the yield layer. We actually work very symbiotically with folks like banks, and we have a number of conversations ongoing. I firmly believe that in the US, most major banks will have Bitcoin custody, not crypto custody. We'll say Bitcoin custody, either through a Coinbase or potentially direct within the next 5 years. And I think you'll start to see, okay, we've got Bitcoin on balance sheet. The next thing is, how do I go earn on that Bitcoin, right? That's the natural next evolution. That's exactly where we want to come in, right? We want to be this back-end yield infrastructure for Bitcoin. So as long as you have Bitcoin on your balance sheet or customer Bitcoin somewhere, you can now go put that to work in our system with no principal risk. And that's ultimately where we will help kind of bring these products and services to market, because everyone will want Bitcoin, everyone will want Bitcoin yield.
Let's just address the risk that Bonnie brought up earlier and get into more detail. Do you actually custody the Bitcoin yourself?
We do not. It never leaves your custody.
Okay.
So like this is another one that I kind of a common line that I say, never send me your Bitcoin.
Okay.
Like I never want it. I would never send my Bitcoin to someone else. So I would never ask someone to do the same.
Okay. So there's no risk of you just taking the Bitcoin, is somebody might ask.
Correct, because you're just time locking it on the Bitcoin at L1. So from like a technical perspective, that UTXO never leaves your wallet. You just cannot spend it. So the risk that you have is liquidity risk, because if you cannot spend it, you cannot move it to sell it or bring it to an exchange or anything of that nature.
Is there a staking period?
Minimum of 1 day.
Okay. Is there a maximum?
There is no maximum.
I'm guessing the yield goes up with more time.
Not currently. That is something that we've discussed at length. Having additional like yield curve components on top of the existing staking dynamic is a lot for the market to absorb right now.
Okay.
Because we already have a non-linear staking curve. So what you now wind up with adding duration on top of that is you get a multivariate non-linear curve. And we've been trying to figure out how to explain this to people, but it will go live not far from now.
If I were PIMCO or any bond fund, okay, and I go to you and say, hey, could you help me construct a Bitcoin fixed income product using CoreDAO? How would you respond to that?
The answer is yes. Like you can kind of almost think about what we're doing is really like a Bitcoin bond layer.
That's
right. Like that. That's kind of the idea. So what we want to enable is people to build additional products and services on top of what we're doing, right? And this is a good example of like what Maple has launched with the LST. The idea is, okay, if you have Bitcoin, how do I go get enough core to then go get these high yield? And they tokenize that entire trade. And then soon there'll be a liquid staking derivative that will come off of it. But we're going to see more and more of these that will take on additional sources of risk, if you will. So another example that I give people all the time is pretty common trade is like Bitcoin basis trading, or they'll do like call overriding, right? So if you can bring our staking yield as your collateral into one of these other trades, now you can go earn, let's call it, 2 to 4%, whatever that is, plus you get the staking rate. Okay, that trade now gets significantly more profitable. So this is how like we're that underlying layer that people, hedge funds, et cetera, can build on top of.
Just one more follow-up question. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. What does a staker give up? In other words, what does it cost for the staker to earn the yield?
So in this case, what they're doing is, and again, it wouldn't be just in Core's ecosystem. You can think about this in any staking ecosystem. When you are giving your voting power to some validator, you are now delegating the responsibility to one, vote on governance and these other pieces, but you cannot move those funds for some period, right? Like you have a liquidity duration, but that is not unique to our ecosystem, right? In the example of Ethereum, what you're doing is you're taking 32 ETH, you bring it to a validator, and then that 32 ETH, until you get it back from that, you cannot actually use that for anything else. Very similar in Core system.
I'm trying to imagine my mom watching this, and her question would be, okay, well, you say Bitcoin is digital gold. Now, if I put my gold in a vault, why do I get yield?
So I think the idea of like putting your Bitcoin in a vault is what we want to kind of kill off to a degree.
Okay.
Because I think that's how maybe not kill off, maybe that's too strong, but the idea of not using your Bitcoin, we think is just not utilizing it to the fullest capacity that it can have. And I like, as someone who's been sitting on Bitcoin now for over a decade, that hasn't really left my wallet for a long time, right? Like it's just been this passive asset. But why would you not want to go use your Bitcoin in some way, shape, or form? And again, the leverage example that David brought up, I think is a pretty common one. People don't want to pay taxes in their Bitcoin ever else. They just want to borrow dollars to go kind of hit these expenses. Okay, that makes sense. Even that, in my opinion, is like a significant step up to just get people comfortable with doing that. But all of this is a continuum. So like many people, the only thing they want to do with Bitcoin is just sit on it today. We can only offer them education. For people that might want passive yield, awesome. You can go into staking or dual staking. Okay, if you're ready for full Bitcoin DeFi and that sort of thing, you can wrap, swap, bridge, whatever. That's a much, much smaller segment than everyone else is. What we want to do is just kind of get people products and services that meet their goals. But I think the idea of it being like locked away and you've thrown away the key, that's an idea that we want to broaden the Overton window in people's thought process, because you don't need to do that unless you just want to do that.
I guess my actual question would be, how does that help your ecosystem? Me putting my digital gold in a vault. How does that help Core? Like, why are you paying me a yield to do that?
Yeah, because you're helping to secure our network. So
that is, I think, what a lot of people do not understand.
So, and I think people haven't really gotten used to having a consensus mechanism that has multiple ingredients. Mm-hmm. And we're not the only one, but I think we're probably the only one that has 3. So we have 75% of the Bitcoin hash. There's about 230 million core and about 7,500 Bitcoin that all factors into core security. And the way to think about it is in most ecosystems, you just have one hard to acquire thing, right? So you just have Ethereum or Solana or one of these things. And to go attack it, we have to do is get a large quantum of that, attack the validator set, and go from there. In Core's ecosystem, you need to get 3 hard to acquire things. It's Core, it's Bitcoin, and it's also this Bitcoin hash. And that's very valuable to us, not just from our alignment with Bitcoin, but also the security and resiliency of the network. And that's why we pay the rewards for the security that folks are exchanging by locking up their Bitcoin hash or the Core.
What are the tax implications of Bitcoin yield? I'm just curious, since you brought up tax.
So in terms of tax, it's income in most jurisdictions.
Yeah.
I'm not a tax professional. Sure. I don't play one on TV.
I guess
that's the classic.
Varies where you are, but just generally, in principle, what does it count as?
Generally, it's income.
Okay.
Right. And it's priced at the time of when you receive it. Again, nothing unique about our system in that way, but staking is inefficient from that point of view.
Okay. Well, let's talk about something new that's that you're doing. So actually, before we talk about this new system, let's just talk about the growth so far. Core DAO's grown from about 18 million users to 52.6 million addresses just in the past year. What contributed to that growth?
So I think what we've seen over the past year is one, this shift of people being more open to go do stuff with their Bitcoin for the first time. And again, that's a decade-long journey that will take to fully realize it. But we've had a big growth in terms of products and services and real businesses being built on Core as these things scale up. And I think we're past the phase of crypto where it's just you launch a token, there's no product market fit, and you kind of go away. A lot of the businesses on Core are more focused on revenue generation and building for the long term. And that's something that we look for in builders that we want to help promote and go to market with. But also we need these folks to be able to have long-term sustainable businesses. So a good example is one like co-lend, right? So borrow and lend isn't sexy, I would say, but it's the key piece of all financial systems is debt, right? And being able to borrow and have liquid markets. And that business has grown from early last year of not existing to now hundreds of millions of TVL. And it's got a fairly active market and there's quite a few participants because it meets a need for Bitcoiners, right? Whether they want to borrow dollars against their Bitcoin or they want to borrow different assets to go use the Core ecosystem for trading. But you have a market there that's forming and you have more and more people coalesce around these products. And then on the other side, we've had quite a bit of growth in protocols like Bitflux. Bitflux is a stable swap for Bitcoin. There's so many Bitcoin derivatives, LSTs. As those grow and proliferate, you get more and more trading volume, more and more real activity. And then I'd say the kind of final thing is we're trying to onboard more and more people into this ecosystem that may have historically not had a lot of great DeFi opportunities. So one of the ones that I'm super excited about is a group called Nawa Finance. Nawa Finance is the first Sharia compliant DeFi aggregator. So the entire Islamic world has been pretty much barred from DeFi for the last since DeFi was created. So now there's actually products and services that can address hundreds of millions or billions of people around the world. That's how you not only expand the TAM, but you have, again, real products that deliver value for these different communities. And there's a ton of Bitcoin in that area in particular that historically has been locked out from yield opportunities and now can go do that on Core for the first time. So I think it's a combination of product market fit, great builders, great protocols, and then trying to do novel, interesting things.
Why couldn't Islamic world do staking again?
So you need a ruling on all of these things. But traditionally, when you get to things like lending, you get to haram yields. So you get to things that are outlawed in terms of earning in different fashions. I'm not an Islamic finance expert, don't get me wrong. But we have spent a significant amount of time in that region to understand these problems more, to partner with amazing builders. And from an ecosystem point of view, we want to have primitives that they can build on top of to ultimately provide value to their end users.
What are they doing differently? Now it's not haram.
So it comes down to the sources of yield. Right? So staking can be a good source of yield depending on how it's generated. You can get into other sorts of protocols as well. You can think of interest-bearing stables potentially, depending how the interest is generated. You have to go into the underlying yield mechanisms of all of these protocols and essentially go all the way through to a scholar to ensure that this is actually okay. Because otherwise, if you wind up with like haram yields or just money that you shouldn't have, you should not be able to like profit off of that, according to kind of the classic teachings.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, let's pitch this to some Islamic finance people. Let's see what they think. That's our producer over there. He's Muslim.
He's smiling the whole time.
Yeah, well, we'll ask him for his feedback later. But let's talk about LST-BTC. It's a new liquid staking token that you just launched. How does it work?
So if we think about Core's Bitcoin staking, right, that was broad-based acclaim, all that sort of stuff. But in order to have a healthier, sustainable yield, we came up with dual staking. And the idea was to have higher yields. You had to become a participant in the Core ecosystem. And by acquiring a Core and Bitcoin position, not only are you aligning the two networks, but you now get much higher yields. So as of now, the just base staking rates 10 to 30 bips, the max dual staking rates about 400 to 500 bips. So you have a significant difference, multiplicative, and that's that nonlinear staking curve that I mentioned. So building off of that, there's this kind of hurdle that a lot of people have, which is, okay, they want to go get this high yield, but they only have Bitcoin. So how do you go make it a way for them to go get access to that core, to go put on that trade in a really simple and combined way, and then be able to have the liquidity to go bring that into DeFi or CeFi ecosystems? So how the LST works, it's a partnership between us and Maple Finance. Bitcoin comes in, Core gets acquired using a low LTV loan, Core gets hedged, and then the idea is you get this receipt token. This receipt token you can bring into a number of DeFi protocols when it goes live in the next month or two, or soon be able to use it as collateral on many of these centralized exchanges. And that's a big push for us because, again, think about like a non-retail use case, market makers, et cetera, constantly are posting Bitcoin collateral, right? So if you're posting Bitcoin collateral, why would you not want yield-bearing Bitcoin collateral, right? It's a strictly better option, provided it's in a custodian, like a BitGo, a Hex Trust, or a Copper in Core's case, and that list is expanding. But the idea now is you get this strictly better solution where you can now go bring this and make your strategies more profitable, or at least not negative carry. And the idea behind the LST was no longer having trade-offs between being an institutional grade custody and having best-in-class Bitcoin yield. You can now have all of the above.
Okay.
Now, if I have my Bitcoin in Coinbase or Binance, take me step by step. What should I do to get all the benefits you just mentioned?
Oh, man. I don't want to anger my former folks over at Coinbase. So we don't have integrations with these exchanges today. I think as time goes on, we will look to make the product more and more ubiquitous. Today, if you wanted to go mint the LST, what you would have to do is use one of the custodians that's in the network once it goes live. Or what you'll be able to do soon enough is to swap into it in DeFi protocols.
So what I'm asking is, okay, so a lot of retail investors, they have their Bitcoin on a centralized exchange. So first they have to transfer it out. So I just want to know what they would have to do, like each step, what they would have to do to have my Bitcoin earn yield. What is the step?
So two different questions, if you will. One is how do you take like your native Bitcoin and get the LST? The other is like, how do you just go earn yield on your Bitcoin? They're using the same underlying mechanism, but they're actually two very, very different paths. So in terms of how do I go earn yield on my Bitcoin? Well, you'd withdraw it from your Binance, your Coinbase, et cetera. You would then stake it using a wallet of your choosing or to craft a transaction on your own. And then you would optionally stake Core alongside of it. But that would be the flow of, I'm sitting on my Bitcoin, I want to maintain it in full self-custody, I want to go earn passive yield. And that's one approach, and that's the majority of how people use it today. With the LST, what you'd have to do is go from native Bitcoin either through a custodian to go mint the LST, or what you would do is you'd bring it into a wrapped asset like a WBTC or similar, CBBTC, and then you would trade to go get the LST in a DeFi protocol. And then if you had that LST, you now be earning that passive yield alongside just holding that token, right? But this is where when I refer to us as the like liquidity infrastructure, it's that same dual staking mechanic that's enabling all of these different products and services, and also other amazing LSTs like Solve and that sort of thing that's also based upon Core's yield. It's this primitive that we've created for Bitcoiners to utilize.
I think I'm hearing you putting Bitcoin to work, right? Historically, people want to put it in a safe, but you're asking your Bitcoin, hey, go out and work for me.
To whatever degree you're comfortable with. Like that's the way to think about it, where again, some people want to go to the total extreme end and they want to like lever up and do derivatives trading, whatever else. And for some people, that's awesome. But for a lot of people, they want to just kind of creak out of the door and they want to just have passive yield, and that's also fine. And that's why we've taken an approach of having different products and services that match these different end goals and also like the trust risk assumptions, et cetera, because that's how we actually unlock the $2 trillion of Bitcoin. If I try to use, David's term of square peg in a round hole, if I try to force you into derivatives trading or something like that, and that's not like, I'm going to burn you and we're never going to be able to have like a successful, symbiotic relationship.
What is the yield? I don't think we've given a number yet.
So the yield fluctuates. It's based on market forces.
Right.
Today, the low end of that yield, if it's just Bitcoin, is between 10 to 30 bips typically. And on the high end, it fluctuates between 400 to 600 bips.
Market forces being like the US 10-year interest rate or something else?
So today, it's mostly the core Bitcoin ratio and then also how this Bitcoin gets staked because of that nonlinear curve. Right? So you have different buckets, and those different buckets will impact that yield curve in different ways.
I guess indirectly, let's say a Fed funds rate cut or a hike, would that matter for the yield?
Not directly, but indirectly, it would affect people's yield expectations.
Sure, of course.
Thing, right? So like in today's system, if you max dual stake your Bitcoin, you're actually beating the Fed funds rate in Bitcoin terms. That's really appealing, right? So I think long term, there is some amount of like yield targeting, kind of like, board of governors type thing that eventually might, get put in place here as time goes on. But as of now, I'd say that's more how people view these trades and how they want to put it on. If they want to go look at it as like kind of competing with, the Fed funds rate or doing something more exotic. And
how would that range be decided? Is there a governance structure here, or is that just you and, your friends?
No, there's core is a DAO.
Yeah.
So there's like on-chain voting that goes into these things. But I would say like to go into, again, that like kind of thought process of how this impacts things, the analogy is really to the like traditional capital markets, right? Where it's like, okay, you have this risk-free rate. This risk-free rate goes into, okay, what are the lending rates? All these things kind of cascade off of this. And this is exactly the vision of how core will function. And we're already starting to see this where people say, okay, if I can go earn, let's say 4 to 6% of my Bitcoin, why am I only getting, 4.5% to go lend out my Bitcoin, right? Like that is a very different risk association for maybe even less return. And what we're ultimately trying to do is help people, one, create a market for this and actually give people more options, but two, to push up the risk premium that these other things are associated with. Because if you can earn, let's say, 4 to 6% passively, well, to go get me to lend my Bitcoin, maybe I need 8, 9, 10%, right? And I think that's very healthy as we start to build more and more Bitcoin capital markets, not just from like a retail perspective, but also a more institutional perspective.
Right.
In one of your interviews, you said LST BTC can be used in basis trade. And I'm very interested. How does that work?
So you can do on-chain basis trades and that sort of thing, but those haven't really scaled, I think. And there's been some folks that have tried that in Solana and other ecosystems. But the ultimate goal is to have this LST BTC be this collateral asset on the largest exchanges in the world. And the reason that we want that is you can now bring over that yield with you. And you can think about USDE and some of these other, yield-bearing crypto projects that have integrated with the Bybits, et cetera, of the world. And now you have that yield. It's a better collateral for you than like a USDT. Risk assumptions, everything involved there, right? But with that, if you can now bring that over, you can now make your strategy that much more profitable. And if you look at Bitcoin basis trading, it's not the most profitable strategy, but it's very reliable. So now if you can go bring this in as what we refer to as like a layered yield or like a yield enhancer, those strategies get that much more profitable. And it's also a great driver of demand for this product.
You brought up, okay, let's go back to the risk question. You brought up Celsius, BlockFi. I've actually had I don't know if you want to call it pleasure or displeasure of interviewing Alex Mashinsky on many occasions in the past. And I remember we talked about yield a lot. And there was a debate between Peter Schiff and Mashinsky that I helped produce. And in the conversation about yield, Schiff asked him, how are you generating double-digit yields? I mean, you must be taking a tremendous amount of risk on the back end. Alex's answer was, of course, we're not. Later, it was shown that they were indeed taking on excessive leverage, which contributed to their fall. If Schiff were sitting here today and he's asking the same question, 9-10% in today's market conditions seems excessive. How can you convince us that you're not another Celsius?
So one, we never take possession of the Bitcoin.
Right.
So it's always with you.
Right.
But in this case, we would never promise something like 9, 10, et cetera % yield. Yeah. It's all driven by market forces. And I think like another example would be like a Terra Luna, et cetera, where it was like, okay, here's 20%, no matter what the inputs are, right? Like that system is just unstable, right? So in our case, like, yeah, it's at 4 to 6% now. That very well could be at a much lower percentage over time. It depends on how much comes into the protocol and how much offsetting demand that there is. But ultimately, it has to float. But it's not really the Bitcoin bond layer in Core's case that's where the excess risk gets involved. It's what gets built on top of it, right? Like we're this base layer primitive that has no principal risk associated with it. We can't control what the hedge fund layer does.
Sure.
Right? And we'll see, and we've chatted with a number of these protocols that want to go use our LST as the input into lending strategies and other things on top of it. And what they need to do is disclose exactly how that's going to go get used, right? Because that's where you get to compounding risk. Because not only are you now transferring your Bitcoin into one of these other protocols, but you don't know exactly what they're doing. But they should be compensating you for whatever risk is going on there. I think if we look at BlockFi, Genesis, Celsius, et cetera, not only was it under collateralized lending, which should already be like pretty far out on the risk spectrum, but also maybe some disclosures that weren't quite, what was actually going on. And like a lot of it was the GBTC ARB and a few of these other pieces that like unwound in like relatively spectacular fashion. But it's important that as soon as you go into something that like is higher risk or even low risk in our case, you should understand exactly where the yield comes from and then what you're getting into.
You probably talk to a lot of institutions and hedge funds, like you mentioned. What are their concerns?
So the first thing that most people say is like, I'm never giving you my Bitcoin. Like that's the first thing that everyone says. And as you can tell as part of this conversation, like that's where a lot of these naturally go. And that's the whole first thing is we need to convince people that we don't actually want your Bitcoin, right? Like do not send it to us. We don't want possession. If you send it to us, you don't get more yield. Like you just give us a new problem, right? So in general, like that's where a lot of these go. And the other piece is that we also try to say that start with whatever you're comfortable with. You might have 10,000 Bitcoin, start with 1 Bitcoin, right? Like you don't need to go all in on day one. This is a multi-decade project. You need to just scale in at whatever you feel comfortable and get to whether it's just pure Bitcoin staking or dual staking. But that's a whole process because historically what people are trying to do with these institutions is give me all of your Bitcoin. I'm going to go bring it into DeFi for you. And then with this DeFi, I'm going to give you some amount of yield back. It's going to be like pretty opaque and not that transparent. And for some people, that's okay, that are like on the bleeding end of the risk spectrum, but not the majority of institutions that we talk to. We're trying to build a product that people can get comfortable with and ultimately deploy in over time. And that with our yield curve being 81 years on this very gradual emission, we want people to, for lack of better words, like set it and forget it with kind of the products that they create and build off of this yield. But we view it as much more of like kind of an enterprise, selling process of trying to go through all the different details, even down to questions like tax and otherwise, because these are the questions the largest capital allocators have. And then it's, 14, 15, et cetera, touch points to get people to understand exactly what they're going to deal with before they'll ultimately deploy. But we ultimately have to go at whatever pace they want to move.
So if I stake both Bitcoin and Core, the Bitcoin yield, so-called, I'll just stake it, right? And if I'm a big institution, I would ask, what does it look like on my balance sheet then?
Great question. This is where you get into like different financial regimes and like different areas and that sort of thing. But depending on how you acquire the Bitcoin and acquire the core, they can either be assets or liabilities, right? Like in some cases, people will try to borrow the core or they'll borrow the Bitcoin, right? But you can kind of wind up on either the right or the left side, depending on how that looks. But the income of like the staking piece or whatever would be revenue in this case.
Well, I'd like to talk about you for a couple minutes.
Let's do it.
So in my introduction, I alluded to the fact that you've had a storied career working in other exchanges leading up to your aha moment. We need to stake Bitcoin. We need to scale Bitcoin. So just walk us through your career. And I'd like to get a sense of how you think the industry has shifted. But let's talk about your career so far.
Oh man, we're going down to like, where do we start? Do we start at the lemonade stand or do we?
The first time you discovered maybe crypto and ultimately leading up to Coinbase and then now. Okay.
So back in 2011, I think it was 2010 or 2011, we got introduced to the Byzantine Generals program, Byzantine Generals problem as part of this directed reading program in college. And we had a professor that was explaining this problem to us and we didn't really understand it. Like, and I couldn't understand like why it was so impressive. And there's money in the computer. Like,
you did engineering?
So I studied information systems economics.
Okay.
Which is databases and like pre-crypto. Like I didn't know it was exactly the like introspectrum that this would be, but they were just kind of where my brain naturally went to. And that's why we were taking that class. It was like kind of peak Stuxnet, like all of that, like computer hacking, all that sort of stuff was like very top of mind. And as part of that, it didn't really resonate because I was coming at it from probably too academic of a perspective, not really understanding the global impact of what something like this could have. And then in 2013, after I got like reintroduced to Bitcoin, went back to the white paper again, that's when it clicked for me as, wait a second, we can actually disintermediate banks. Maybe we can actually build a better money. And we thought we were building money at that point. And I don't think Bitcoin's really money at this point.
What about the white paper originally most appealed to you?
I think the idea was having a non-sovereign store of value. Like forever, it's like, hey, you have the US dollar, it's backed by, the government and guns and whatever else. And it's like, well, could you actually create something that has value? And by 2013, that was when we had really kind of the second Bitcoin price runs, right? Up to like 1,000 for the first time. And that was the first time I was like, wow, people are actually valuing this thing, right? Like, and I think we got involved in the hundreds or whatever, but it was like, wow, this is really interesting that other people view this as valuable in a way that is totally non-consensus, right? Like there's no central bank of Bitcoin that is saying this is what this is worth or whatever, right? It was all a free market dynamic. And that was what was so appealing because that's when I got my first like glimpse into the future, if you will, of wow, I could see this being the underpinning of like some new disintermediated financial system.
It's funny that you brought up the white paper is kind of your inspiration. I'll get to the rest of your story because what Satoshi wrote in that white paper was that Bitcoin was meant to be a decentralized peer-to-peer system, which is not what you're building now. Like there's, we're not trying to use Core so I could send Bonnie money, right? In a sense.
You can use Core to send Bonnie money or send Bonnie Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And it's definitely like, you
want my Core, okay.
I want.
Send your Core and your Bitcoin. And it's a much more efficient, like cheaper way to send Bitcoin and that sort of thing. And that's important because the vast majority of the world, the Bitcoin main chain is too expensive, right? Or at least times of congestion. So there is a need to move some of this off of the Bitcoin main chain over time. But I think when you talk about it as a money, that's what actually got me really excited because decentralized money, the TAM is enormous, right? And like we all get really excited about that. And I've got a lot of very expensive coffees from like, around that time frame. But I think that was what was so exciting about it is that it was peer-to-peer. There was no central bank of Bitcoin. Like you could just go create. And that's when we saw a lot of like the first use cases of trying to use Bitcoin for spending. And that really opened up, I think, a lot of people's attention to what Bitcoin could be. But then we've deviated pretty far from that over time, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Store of value is an enormous use case, even if we never make it to medium of exchange.
So once you got to Coinbase, without going into details about your experience at Coinbase if you don't want to, but what did you feel was lacking in centralized exchanges at the time?
Centralized exchange business is really profitable and like a super interesting business. And like I really enjoyed my time there. I met a lot of amazing people.
Sure.
But at least from my like view at the time.
What were you doing there exactly?
So I ran money movements engineering. So it was like on all the on and off platform fund movements, which was a lot of fun. We got to chase bad guys. We got to get a lot of like money onto the platform. Company went public during that time. Like I really enjoyed it. But I would say that Coinbase has always had a little bit more of like an Ethereum lens to it. And you can see Base now, I think, is like more or less eating Ethereum. And they've done a ton of good for the crypto ecosystem writ large, but also the Ethereum ecosystem in particular. My, kind of bent has always been more to the Bitcoin side. And I've always more identified as like kind of more of a Bitcoin maxi and all that sort of thing as time has gone on. I don't have that view today, but I always identified more with kind of that view of crypto. And that's what originally got me so excited about it in the first part. So it was going back to first principles while taking a lot of the best lessons that we learned from Ethereum. Like the reason I decided to do this in my career in 2017 was because of Ethereum. It was, okay, we have this money in terms of Bitcoin that's totally decentralized, but it wasn't really programmable. Ethereum, when we had the first tokens, et cetera, was, wow, you have programmable money for the first time. That's this amazing Lego block that you can build off of. And that was really kind of the genesis of putting all that prehistory into one place, and that became Core.
I talked to Adam back before, and he is the Bitcoin OG, and he talked about when the Satoshi white paper came out, a lot of cyberpunk people actually hated it because it was too transparent. There's no privacy. You know how they actually like privacy and it's on the blockchain and everything You can see everything publicly. What is your view when you read the white paper at the time?
I don't think I was as focused on privacy, to be honest, but I think it now has become a big focus area for me. Private Bitcoin transactions are kind of the holy grail. And if not private, maybe, confidential. And I think that's what we're seeing some interesting experimentation on. That, David and Bonnie are transacting, but maybe not what they're transacting or how much. And that's fairly compliant with like most regulatory regimes. We can't do that on Bitcoin. I think we have lost that time to add privacy to Bitcoin. It's probably a good thing potentially that we never did. That's hotly debated, if you will. But I think systems like Core could potentially have opt-in privacy for these transactions. And that would be very useful, not just for sending stables, but for also sending Bitcoin. But I totally appreciate what Adam is saying. And I think private transactions are, a human right, if you will, but we've never been able to fully do that in a way that's compliant. And if you look at Monero, Zcash, et cetera, like having private transactions has led to a lot of issues with regulators. So it's some sort of efficient frontier there that I think we're still working through. But I do think solutions like Core that allow you to put your Bitcoin to work could have opt-in privacy or opt-in confidentiality. And that's something we're very excited about.
I never really understood the use case of privacy. Okay, let's say I'm making transactions and I don't want my wife to know. And I want to use my credit card. What else do I use?
I don't know. I don't know about your individual marriage, marriage situation.
Don't bring your family problem here.
Yeah, I don't know about that one. So I'm going to go pretty far to the side of that one. But I think in general, I don't know that you'd want your credit card statement to be on public display.
Sure.
And that's effectively how blockchains work today.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's just it's very useful in some ways because it allows you to have a decentralized ledger that everybody can check and all that sort of stuff. But I think if you have the ability to say that I don't want things to be public unless I choose to,
right,
that's a strictly better solution. And I think it's also what we've gotten used to in normal life, right? Like when you swipe a credit card and that sort of stuff, it doesn't get broadcast for everyone else to see.
Right.
So we've kind of inverted that model. And the other weird part about blockchains is you as the payer are the ones that pay the fees versus the merchant, except it's inverted in a lot of these different ways. And that makes it difficult to make it skeuomorphic with existing products and services that we have. So I think you'll start to see over time more and more of that become kind of more like the legacy system, which actually has some better guarantees and better principles than we have today.
All right, good.
If there is this privacy tech on top of it, does that mean if a hacker hack your fund, now you can't trace it?
Depends on how the privacy is implemented. So, and that's kind of a cop-out answer, but I'll try to explain it. So if you go to systems like Monero, which historically are very resilient in terms of privacy, you have issues when you have hacks, and that's it's very difficult. And that's one of the reasons that they've had issues with regulators, because you can't actually tell how much money are people sending and all that sort of thing. Kind of the new, more cutting edge, let's call it, are these confidential systems. And the confidential systems tend to have something like an auditor key. And the idea is to everyone externally who is not an auditor, all that we can see is you two are transacting. We don't know what, we don't know how much. But if you have this auditor key, it all is now public. So not that it's public to the chain, but public to the auditor. And that's very useful for AML, KYC, et cetera, compliance. And I think that might be the efficient frontier for a lot of these things. And that probably meets a lot of folks' goals. Not maybe the pure cypherpunk goal where, that's more Monero, I would say. But I think it's all about kind of the practical realities of where we're at. But there is some really amazing technology that's coming to light on that. And I'm really excited about it.
It sounds less decentralized. So that would not be a focus.
It's still decentralized.
But somebody holds the key.
Somebody holds the key, not for the transaction, but just how to read it.
Right.
It's still the transaction. It's just you have this one actor that can introspect into the system.
So, okay. So
let me give you an example.
Okay.
So let's imagine that, trying to think of how to work in David's, family situation.
Yes.
But let's say you have
my non-existent wife was watching. Be careful.
Okay, perfect. So let's say you're going to build decentralized Venmo or something.
Yeah.
Right. And you want to have this really high throughput, really awesome interface that everyone's using, whatever else. But you also want to be, or you're also subject to US compliance restrictions or something.
Yes.
Right. All those transactions have to be totally decentralized using your protocol.
Yeah.
But should the government come in or whatever, you can then say, oh, and indeed, this was not an OFAC restricted piece or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's no less decentralized in terms of the transactions, just there is the ability to introspect. And that might be the efficient frontier of how you can actually get to practical privacy. And I think what we've learned over time is like there are some trade-offs that have to be made in order to get some of the different pieces that you want out of these systems. And for some people, that's probably a better compromise than being purely in public. But ultimately, you'll have to make the products and decisions. In my view, it's no worse than what you currently have.
Is this conversation completely moot once CBDCs become effective?
Oh, man. CBDCs, I'm not super long on, to be honest. I think maybe we'll see some in like some countries over the next few years, but I think it creates a whole lot of other issues. And I think we haven't like fully appreciated what full CBDCs will do, because especially in an area of like, tons of fiat debasement, et cetera, CBDCs naturally go to like censorship. You'll go to like, financial inclusion problems, and then you eventually get to capital controls. Like it spirals really quickly. And I don't know that that's a good thing. And I think we will have quite a bit of resistance to things like CBDCs around the world.
I think Trump, correct me if I'm wrong, he did ban CBDCs, did he not?
No CBDCs.
Yeah.
He has banned it. The US, it's always like, who's in power, how's it flip-flop, whatever. But there's other countries like, I believe Brazil, that are like actively experimenting with CBDCs.
Sure.
So we'll see this all get, kind of litigated and figured out in the courts. But it's going to be challenging. And I think if we do go down that world, decentralized blockchains become that much more important, right? For more than just like kind of general, unstable currency situations.
I read this chart that over 90% of the world is either experimenting or building CBDC or interested. At least 90% is a high number.
Super high number. I think it's like it's the dream for a government, right? Like any sort of government would love to have perfect auditability, perfect verifiability, capital control, censorship. Like it's 1984, like on steroids, right? So like, I'm not surprised that people are experimenting and they're like trying to figure stuff out. Whether or not that gets implemented, I think is a very, very different story, but it makes sense of why governments would want it. And it's the exact reason why citizens don't want it, right? Like that you have this very natural tension between those different things. And I think the US is leading in a lot of these areas, as David mentioned, where we said, hey, we won't have any CBDCs. We're now moving towards stablecoin legislation that will allow you to have decentralized money. And I think the more and more that becomes popularized, the more opposition you will have to some of these other CBDCs, which I think are pretty dangerous overall.
I'm just imagining if, a person in government, they're like, how do I manage my country? Then I will try to push for CBDC, and I'll probably try to convince the people that this is good.
Without going into too much of like philosophy or whatever, government and central planning hasn't worked out too well in most cases. So I think giving like full autonomy over like individual transactions and that sort of stuff becomes really, really bad from a government perspective. Because now, like, again, like in most systems, we want them to be egalitarian and everything else. But in reality, and look at the last administration in the US, not everybody is treated the same. And okay, if I don't like some political party or they just won or whatever, okay, what do I do to disenfranchise them? Well, if I can now block all of their transactions, you now have a very different system. And that amount of government control, I think, is not beneficial in any system, whether it's the US or otherwise, because I think it naturally just gives too much power down to the individual level, and it becomes, Black Mirror, I think, pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Black Mirror in the future, is the future of money dystopian or utopian? Just paint us a picture for not just our generation, but maybe our kids' generation. What does money look like?
Getting philosophical. I like this. So I think, and this is going to be like kind of trite, but I think it really depends on what you think the level of like human productivity and human progress is over like the next, let's call it 5 to 10 years. And I think if we continue to see this productivity boom that we're seeing primarily driven by AI right now, I think money will change significantly, because I think we can get to a spot not far from now where agents and otherwise are actually going out there and working on our behalf. And a lot of these are microtransactions that we are never really kind of privy to, right? It's kind of going on in this, asynchronous world. And I think that's just a totally new concept that we're not ready for. And I think that's also where blockchains really shine, because you have the ability to trustlessly exchange value amongst all these different participants. But I think on a general, like let's put that as like the rosy case, right? Where it's like productivity increased to such a level, most people don't have to work, and all of that is kind of going well. I think on the other side, you're going to have more and more fiat debasement, and you're going to have these issues where the value prop of Bitcoin becomes that much more interesting. And I think in that world, things like Bitcoin become that much more sacred because it becomes a lot more dystopian, where your asset of whatever country you're in is just constantly getting devalued. Asset prices go up, but everything else, from an affordability point of view, gets inflated away. And that's a really dangerous setup. Without going too much into like economics, I think we might be on like a little bit of an unstoppable, debt roller coaster.
One of the coolest concepts of money ever I've seen is used in science fiction. In Star Trek, they don't actually have money. They use credits for intergalactic trade, but because they have these like replicators, you can print food or whatever you want, whenever you want. So you don't need a form of trade. You don't need a medium of exchange when you could just create your own stuff. Right. I mean, just that. I don't know. Can you comment? I'm just trying to get a facial reaction out of you.
Yeah, you're gonna get my face going all different directions.
That's my last question. I promise.
I love it. Yeah, I don't really remember Star Trek. I've seen like various, like William Shatner episodes.
But you've seen like you can I want steak, and then the steak comes out.
But this is what I would say is like a dramatic extension of like that AI productivity boom.
Right.
Which is like, you don't have to work. Everything, there's no scarcity. Like you get to that world, you don't really need money because everything's like purely abundant.
That's it.
But I think and this is where you get to that kind of that contrasting view of like, okay, do we live in that world? Or do we live in unstoppable debt roller coaster where the only thing in the world that has any value anymore is Bitcoin? And essentially all trusted intermediaries are in really bad places. Like those are two totally opposite, like kind of states of the world. But there's some sort of like weighted probability of like where we head and on what time lane. And that's something that we all should be balancing, like those two different modalities in terms of thinking what we get to. We all prefer the Star Trek, kind of view of the universe, but it's really hard to weight that against like all these other macro shifts.
Sure.
Based on what you just said, plus what Brian Johnson said, we don't die. And AI now works for us.
I love this interview.
We don't have to work. Now we have so much time. What do we do? Like, what is that generation like?
It's a great question. And I really wonder what that looks like. Like having seen people go into like retirement mode where like they don't have as much to do anymore, it becomes this like, I don't know, 3/4 life crisis where you like kind of have to figure out, what you want to do and that sort of thing. And I think that is something that people will naturally tend to. And I think it will be a challenge. Like, I don't know, like you sit on the beach and like drink tiki drinks or whatever, like for all time. I don't know. But I think that's like an existential question. I'm hopeful that there's still these society level improvements that people can keep making, whether it's for, monetary reasons or otherwise. In your world of perfect abundance, like you probably don't have that same goal, but might be just pushing like humanity forward in other ways, which would be pretty cool. But I don't know if there's an answer to that. And if Brian's right, we're all going to live to be like 150. So we're going to have to like figure out how that all plays out.
Stake more Bitcoin until you're 150.
It should be like some sort of like steak and steak.
Yeah.
Where like, you're eating a steak and you're like staking your Bitcoin,
Stake Bitcoin, come out, put it back into DAO. Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun, Rich.
Awesome.
Nice meeting you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.